Imagine walking out your front door and finding total strangers setting up tents, arranging flowers, and unloading catering trays, right in your own front yard. You're standing there, stunned, watching as a full-blown wedding is being prepared on your property. There was no warning, no request, no heads up from anyone. Just random people treating your home like it's a rented venue. At first, you think you must be dreaming, or that there's been some huge mistake. But no, this was all planned by your HOA. Without permission. Without legal right. Just complete entitlement and insanity. That's the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overstepping HOA. I was dealing with a total invasion of privacy. And I wasn't about to let it slide. I live in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood that's always looked like the picture of suburban peace. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses spaced out just enough to feel private. My home sits near the end of a cul-de-sac, with a spacious front yard and a backyard that backs up to a small wooded area. It's not a mansion, but it's mine, something I've worked hard for, maintained with pride, and cherished as a place of calm. The kind of place where you expect privacy and mutual respect. And for the most part, that's how things were, until the HOA started getting bolder, more controlling, and eventually crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I've lived in this house for over 7 years. Long enough to know every corner of the property, every neighbor on the street, and every little change in the neighborhood's mood. When I first moved in, things were pretty smooth, quiet neighbors, a respectful HOA, and no real issues to speak of. It was the kind of place where you felt secure, where the rules actually seemed to help keep things in order. But over time, that started to change. The HOA became more aggressive, more entitled, and started making decisions like they owned everything, including my home. When I first moved in, the HOA seemed harmless enough. They sent out newsletters about lawn care tips, held the occasional neighborhood barbecue, and reminded people to keep their trash bins out of sight. It all felt like typical suburban stuff, mildly annoying, but nothing worth pushing back on. But slowly, their control started creeping in. First, it was warnings about the color of mailboxes. Then it became strict rules about garden decorations, parking, even how long holiday lights could stay up. At first, we laughed it off, just the HOA being picky. But then they started issuing fines for things that weren't even in the rulebook, and making executive decisions without any community vote. That's when it became clear, this HOA wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice, it was about power. And eventually, that power trip would land them right in the middle of my property, uninvited. I'm not the kind of person who looks for trouble. I keep to myself, pay my dues, mow my lawn, and respect my neighbors. I've never had a problem with authority, and I've always tried to avoid unnecessary drama. I believe in picking my battles, and for years, I let the little things slide. Even when the HOA made ridiculous demands or sent passive-aggressive letters, I bit my tongue and moved on. But this wasn't a petty rule or an overreach I could ignore. This was my private property being hijacked for a wedding I never agreed to. Strangers on my lawn, using my space like it was some public park, and the HOA acting like they had every right. That's when I knew, this wasn't just a nuisance. This was a fight I had to take on. It started with something subtle, just a couple of people walking around near the edge of my yard, clipboard in hand, pointing at the grass and taking photos. I thought maybe they were with the HOA doing some routine inspection, so I didn't think much of it. But the next day, a landscaping crew showed up and began trimming bushes, laying down decorative stones, and even planting new flowers, without a single word to me. Then came the real shock. A delivery truck rolled up with massive event tents, tables, and chairs. They began unloading everything like this was just another day on the job. Confused, I walked outside and asked what was going on, and that's when one of the workers casually mentioned, "Oh, it's for the wedding this weekend." A wedding? On my property? That was the moment my stomach dropped. Something was seriously wrong. I walked straight over to one of the guys setting up a tent and asked, "What exactly are you doing here?" Without missing a beat, he smiled and said, "Oh, it's for the wedding." Didn't the HOA tell you? I just stared at him, completely dumbfounded. A wedding? On my lawn? He acted like it was the most normal thing in the world, like it was some community clubhouse, not my private property. I told him I hadn't agreed to any event, and this was my home, not a rental venue. But he just shrugged and said they were following HOA orders. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't some mix-up. The HOA had actually planned a full-scale wedding on my property without even asking me. I was absolutely stunned. I never approved anything, no permission, no discussion, not even a heads-up. My property wasn't some public park or shared community space. It was mine. I had the deed, the boundaries were clear, and I had never signed off on a single event. The idea that the HOA thought they could just schedule a full-blown wedding, complete with decorations, caterers, and dozens of guests, without even asking me? It felt like a violation, plain and simple. I stood there looking at the tents being set up on my lawn, the workers casually moving around like they owned the place, and I couldn't wrap my head around how they thought this was even remotely okay. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was completely illegal. Furious and confused, I immediately contacted the HOA to demand an explanation. I expected an apology, maybe even some kind of excuse, but instead, they doubled down. They acted like I was the one being unreasonable. One board member actually said, "It's just a wedding, don't be so dramatic." Another claimed it was part of our community engagement efforts, as if turning my private property into a public venue was a neighborhood improvement. They insisted everything was within their rights, even though I never gave a single ounce of permission. They danced around my questions, deflected blame, and made me feel like I was the problem for standing up for myself. It was classic gaslighting. They knew they were wrong, but they were trying to make me question reality. When I pushed back harder, demanding to know how they could justify hosting an event on my lawn without my permission, they pulled out the most ridiculous excuse yet. They claimed my front yard fell under some vague community accessible space clause or was considered part of the shared amenities listed in the HOA agreement. I've read that agreement cover to cover. Nowhere does it say that my privately owned yard is open for neighborhood weddings. They were twisting the wording to fit their narrative, trying to make it sound like I had unknowingly agreed to let strangers party on my property. It was pure manipulation, and at that point, I knew I had to take control before they walked all over me, literally and legally. When I continued to push back and made it clear that I wasn't going to allow this wedding to happen on my property, the HOA took it a step further. They started threatening me. They warned that if I interfered with the event, I could face hefty fines for non-compliance with community cooperation standards. Whatever that meant. They tossed around vague citations and pulled obscure lines from the HOA handbook, none of which actually applied to private property use. It was obvious they were bluffing, trying to intimidate me into backing down. But I wasn't about to let them bully me into surrendering my own land, especially over a wedding I never agreed to host. At that point, I knew I had to shut this down with facts. So I went and pulled out my property deed, the official documents that lay out every inch of what I legally own. And sure enough, it was all there in black and white. My front yard, my driveway, my entire lot were 100% private property, with no easements, no shared access clauses, and absolutely no community use provisions. I even cross-checked the county property maps just to be sure. There was no ambiguity. The HOA had no legal ground to stand on. They were trespassing, plain and simple, and I finally had the proof I needed to call them out and take control of the situation. Even after I showed them the deed, made it crystal clear that the land was privately owned and off-limits, the HOA doubled down. They brushed off my evidence like it was irrelevant, and insisted the wedding would proceed as scheduled. One board member even had the nerve to tell me, "It's already planned, guests are invited, we can't just cancel now." As if their poor planning justified trampling over my rights. They acted like I was being unreasonable for not letting dozens of strangers throw a party on my lawn. It was infuriating. No matter how many times I said no, they refused to listen. That's when I realized, talking wasn't going to fix this. It was time for action. I tried everything I could to resolve it the right way. I called the HOA repeatedly, sent formal emails, and even had a lawyer draft a cease and desist notice warning them of legal consequences if they moved forward. I made it clear that they were trespassing, violating property laws, and that I wasn't backing down. But none of it worked. They ignored the warnings, dismissed the legal notices, and acted like I was just being difficult. It was like shouting into the wind. They were so confident in their control, so sure they could steamroll over me, that they didn't take a single thing I said seriously. That's when I knew they'd underestimated me completely. Then the big day arrived, and despite everything I'd said and done, the guests showed up anyway. Cars lined the street, people in suits and dresses started walking across my lawn, and the full-blown wedding setup was in full swing. There were tents, tables, flower arrangements, even a stage with a microphone. Music played like it was some grand celebration, on land they didn't own, for an event I never approved. I stood there in disbelief, watching strangers sip champagne on my property like it belonged to them. The audacity was unreal. The HOA had ignored every warning, every legal notice, and every boundary, literally and figuratively. That was the moment I knew, if they were going to treat my land like it was theirs, then I'd show them exactly whose name was on the deed. I'd had enough. Watching those strangers dance and drink on my property while the HOA acted like they owned the place lit a fire in me. So I took control, literally. I marched out there, calm but firm, and announced that this wedding was happening on private property without the owner's consent, and that everyone needed to leave immediately. Some people looked confused, others just ignored me, until I made it clear that I wasn't bluffing. I had already contacted local authorities, I had documentation in hand, and if anyone refused to leave, they'd be trespassing. This wasn't just a personal stand, it was me reclaiming my home from people who thought they could walk all over me. The HOA tried to step in, but by then, it was too late. I had every legal right to shut it all down, and I did. What pushed things over the edge was when I noticed that part of the wedding setup, specifically the stage and some seating, was built right over an old shed at the back of my property. Ironically, I had already scheduled that shed for demolition. It was falling apart, a safety hazard, and completely unusable. So, I made a bold move. I called the demolition crew and told them to come early. Why not? It was my land, my shed, and technically, they were standing on something that was already scheduled to be torn down. The wedding guests had no idea what was coming. I wasn't trying to make a scene, I was simply following through with plans I'd made long before they decided to turn my property into their party venue. If the HOA thought they could use my space for their event, they were about to learn that I still called the shots. The moment the bulldozer rolled onto my property, it was like someone had dropped a bomb in the middle of the wedding. Guests froze, champagne glasses midair, staring in disbelief as the giant machine rumbled toward the shed. Then panic set in. People started scrambling, chairs were knocked over, centerpieces shattered, and heels clicked furiously across the lawn as guests rushed to get out of the way. The caterer looked like he'd seen a ghost, and the DJ actually unplugged his gear mid-song. But the real meltdown came from the HOA president. She came storming toward me, absolutely livid, shouting about how I was ruining a beautiful day. I calmly reminded her, this was my property, that shed was scheduled for demolition, and they never had permission to be here in the first place. Chaos unfolded all around us, and for the first time, the HOA had to face the consequences of thinking they could run over people without ever being challenged. In the aftermath of the chaos, the HOA did exactly what I expected. They threatened to sue me. They claimed I had intentionally disrupted a sanctioned community event and endangered guests. But I wasn't worried, not even for a second. My paperwork was rock solid. I had the property deed, the demolition permits, the legal notices I'd sent them in advance, every piece of documentation proving they had no right to be on my land and that I'd followed the law every step of the way. Their threats were just noise, desperate attempts to save face after being publicly embarrassed. I knew they didn't have a leg to stand on, and more importantly, they knew it too. For once, the HOA wasn't holding the power, I was. Instead of backing down, I went on the offensive. I filed a countersuit, one that hit them from every angle. Trespassing? Absolutely. Property damage? The setup crew had destroyed sections of my lawn and left deep tire ruts all over. Emotional distress? Try waking up to a wedding on your lawn without consent. And most importantly, unlawful use of private land. The HOA had willfully ignored all warnings, twisted their authority, and dragged my name through the mud just to pull off their event. Now they'd have to face the legal consequences of their arrogance. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was sending a message to every HOA bully out there: you don't get to rewrite the rules just because you hold a clipboard. It didn't take long for the story to explode, first in neighborhood gossip groups, then on local news. Photos and videos of the wedding chaos, the bulldozer, and the HOA president's meltdown started circulating like wildfire. People were stunned that an HOA had tried to hijack someone's private property for an event, and even more shocked that they'd ignored legal warnings to do it. Public opinion shifted fast. Neighbors who had once backed the HOA began questioning their tactics, and some even reached out to apologize or express support. Online forums were flooded with comments like, "Good for him," and, "Finally, someone stood up to those tyrants." The HOA, once feared and obeyed, now looked like a reckless, power-hungry group that had finally gone too far. After months of legal battles, the verdict finally came in, and I won. The court ruled in my favor on every count. The HOA was found guilty of trespassing, unlawful use of private property, and causing property damage. They were ordered to pay for all the repairs, cover legal fees, and compensate me for emotional distress. But the most satisfying part? The judge demanded they issue a public apology, in writing, to be shared with the entire neighborhood. That smug, overreaching board was now forced to admit, in plain words, that they were wrong. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. They tried to walk all over me, and in the end, they had to crawl back with their tails between their legs. After months of escalating tension and relentless community pressure, the HOA board members finally tendered their resignations, signaling a major turning point for the neighborhood. This exodus opened the door for fresh leadership and gave residents renewed hope for change. Seizing the moment, the new interim board quickly prioritized drafting a set of revised bylaws aimed squarely at curbing the previously unchecked powers of the HOA. These new rules introduced clearer limits on enforcement actions, improved transparency, and ensured homeowners had a stronger voice in decisions affecting their properties. The atmosphere shifted from fear and frustration to cautious optimism, as the community took its first steps toward reclaiming control and restoring balance in the neighborhood. This wasn't about a wedding. It was about boundaries, ownership, and standing up when someone violates your space without a second thought. What started as a simple disagreement quickly revealed deeper issues. People trying to control what's not theirs and ignoring the respect every homeowner deserves. It became clear this fight wasn't just about one event, but about protecting what's rightfully yours and sending a message that crossing the line won't be tolerated. Sometimes you have to stand firm and defend your space, no matter how small the spark that ignites the fire. HOA overreach is a growing problem in many communities, where homeowner associations stretch their authority beyond reasonable limits, often imposing unfair rules or penalties that impact residents' daily lives. It's crucial for homeowners to understand their property rights because knowing where the HOA's power ends and your rights begin is the first step to protecting yourself. Without that knowledge, it's easy to fall victim to unnecessary fines, restrictions, or even harassment. Homeowners who educate themselves can challenge unfair practices, hold the HOA accountable, and ensure their homes remain a place of comfort and security, not a battleground ruled by an overbearing association. Understanding your rights empowers you to push back against abuse and maintain control over your own property. Ever dealt with HOA madness like this? You know, those moments when rules seem to come out of nowhere, and the association just won't back down no matter how unreasonable they get. I want to hear your stories, those frustrating, wild, or even downright crazy experiences with your HOA. Drop your story in the comments below because I read them all, and sometimes sharing these moments helps us all realize we're not alone in dealing with HOA drama. So don't be shy, let's get the conversation started. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories where justice wins. If you're into hearing true tales of standing up against unfairness, fighting back, and seeing the underdog come out on top, this channel is for you. Your support helps me bring you more of these powerful stories that show how courage and determination can make a real difference. So hit that like button, subscribe, and join the community where justice always finds a way. And remember, just because someone acts like they're in charge doesn't mean they actually are. Sometimes people wield power to intimidate or control, but true authority comes with limits, and knowing those limits is key. Whether it's an overbearing HOA board member or anyone else trying to push you around, don't be fooled by their attitude. Stand your ground, know your rights, and don't let anyone make you feel powerless in your own home or community.